The sun blazed mercilessly over the Pacific on June 3, 1942, as Ensign George Gay adjusted his flight goggles and peered across the endless expanse of blue water. The young torpedo bomber pilot had no idea that within hours, he would become the sole survivor of his entire squadron and witness one of the most decisive naval battles in human history. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron stood before his men of Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the USS Hornet, his weathered face etched with determination. The intelligence reports were clear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's massive Japanese fleet was approaching Midway Atoll with overwhelming force. 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and over 200 aircraft were bearing down on the tiny American outpost 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. "Gentlemen," Waldron's voice carried across the ready room, cutting through the nervous chatter of his 15 pilots. "Tomorrow we face the largest naval force the Japanese have ever assembled. They outnumber us 3-1, but we have something they don't expect: surprise." The American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked the Japanese naval code, JN-25, revealing Yamamoto's entire battle plan. The Japanese believed they were launching a surprise attack. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. Aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo reviewed his battle plans with confident satisfaction. His Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was at full strength. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu carried the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had conquered Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and terrorized the Indian Ocean. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, prepared his aircraft for what he believed would be another devastating blow against American forces. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: crush the American defenders at Midway, then lure the remnants of the Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where superior Japanese numbers would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. But 1,500 miles away, Admiral Chester Nimitz had positioned his forces with surgical precision. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the carrier Yorktown, hastily repaired after the Battle of the Coral Sea, and commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, lay in wait northeast of Midway. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's seminal work, Miracle at Midway, the intelligence breakthrough that enabled American forces to position themselves advantageously was one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. As darkness fell on June 3rd, thousands of young men on both sides made their final preparations. Some wrote letters home, others cleaned their weapons or checked their aircraft one last time. Many simply stared out at the star-filled Pacific sky, sensing that dawn would bring something momentous. Seaman First Class Bruno Guido, aboard the Enterprise, felt the ship's subtle change in rhythm as she turned into the wind. The flight deck crews were already preparing for pre-dawn launches. In a few hours, American dive bombers and torpedo planes would take off in darkness, guided only by dead reckoning and prayer toward an enemy force that still believed it held all the advantages. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War and echo through history as one of the most remarkable naval engagements ever fought. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the first Nakajima B-5N reconnaissance plane lifted off from the cruiser Tone, its engine cutting through the pre-dawn silence. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, leading the initial strike force of 108 aircraft from the 4 Japanese carriers, was already airborne, heading toward what he believed would be lightly defended American positions on Midway Atoll. Attack began at 6:20 as Japanese bombers and fighters swept over the tiny coral island. Marine Captain Marion Carl, leading his Wildcat fighters from Midway's airstrip, climbed desperately to intercept the incoming formation. The odds were hopeless: 26 American fighters against over 70 Japanese aircraft, but the Marines fought with desperate courage. "Tally-ho! Bandits 12 o'clock high!" Carl's voice crackled over the radio as his F-4F Wildcats dove into the enemy formation. The sky above Midway erupted in a deadly dance of tracer bullets and burning aircraft. Within minutes, 17 American fighters were shot down, but they had disrupted the Japanese attack, and bought precious time. On the ground, Colonel Harold, Shannon's Marines manning the anti-aircraft guns poured fire into the sky as Japanese bombs crashed around them. The fuel depot exploded in a towering column of black smoke, and several buildings were destroyed, but the crucial airstrip remained operational. Most importantly, Midway's radar had detected the incoming raid early enough to get every available American aircraft airborne and away from the devastating attack. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, surveying the damage from his bomber, realized that a second strike would be necessary to completely neutralize Midway's defenses. His radio message to Admiral Nagumo would prove to be one of the most fateful communications in naval history. There is need for a second attack wave. But Nagumo faced a critical dilemma. His aircraft were already armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking American ships, should the enemy fleet appear. Tominaga's request meant rearming with fragmentation bombs for another ground attack, a process that would take precious time and leave his carriers vulnerable. At 7 o'clock, the first wave of American attackers found the Japanese fleet. Major Lofton Henderson led 16 Marine dive bombers from Midway in a valiant but suicidal assault on the carrier Hiryu. The obsolete Douglas Dauntless aircraft, flown by barely trained pilots, pressed their attack through murderous anti-aircraft fire. Henderson's plane was shot down in flames, but his name would live on in Marine Corps legend. Captain Richard Fleming continued the attack, diving his burning aircraft directly at the Hiryu's flight deck before crashing into the sea, just short of his target. Not one bomb hit the Japanese carriers, but the continuous stream of attacks kept Nagumo's fleet maneuvering defensively and delayed the critical rearming process. Naval War College analysis, as documented in Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, reveals that these early sacrificial attacks by Midway-based aircraft created the tactical conditions that would later prove decisive. At 8 o'clock, Admiral Nagumo made his fatal decision. Convinced that no American carriers were in the area, he ordered his aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Below decks on all four carriers, ordnance crews frantically removed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive bombs for ground attack. Fuel lines snaked across the hangar decks, and ammunition was stacked everywhere as the crews worked against time. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that reconnaissance plane number 4 from the cruiser Tone, delayed by catapult problems, finally made contact with the American fleet, Petty Officer First Class. Amari Tone's voice cut through the radio static with words that would change everything. Enemy fleet sighted. Appears to be 10 ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The trap was closing, but neither side yet realized that the next few hours would witness the most decisive air-sea battle in the Pacific War. The tension aboard the Japanese carriers was palpable as Admiral Nagumo wrestled with the most crucial decision of his career. At 8:20, the delayed reconnaissance report crackled across the Akagi's bridge. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The words hit Nagumo like a physical blow. American carriers, the very targets Yamamoto had ordered him to destroy, were within striking range. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant tactician who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, urged immediate action. But the timing was catastrophic. Half of Nagumo's aircraft were still being rearmed below decks, their weapons scattered across the hangar floors. The returning Midway strike force, low on fuel and some damaged, circled overhead demanding immediate landing. At 8:37, Admiral Nagumo made his second fatal decision of the day. Prepare to attack enemy carriers, he ordered. Rearm, with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Below decks, exhausted ordnance crews reversed their work, once again removing the high-explosive bombs they had just loaded and replacing them with anti-ship weapons. The hangar decks became death traps of stacked ammunition, fuel lines, and volatile ordnance. 300 miles away, Admiral Raymond Spruance had already launched his strike. At 7 o'clock, 116 aircraft from the Enterprise and Hornet had taken off in the largest American carrier strike of the war to date. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, while Lieutenant Commander John Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 prepared for their rendezvous with Destiny, The American attack developed with tragic miscommunication. The torpedo squadrons, flying low and slow, arrived first and alone. Without fighter escort or dive bomber coordination, they faced the full fury of Japanese defenses. Waldron's 15 Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet pressed their attack with suicidal courage against impossible odds. "We're going in," Waldron radioed to his men as Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. "Make your torpedo count." One by one, the lumbering torpedo bombers fell burning into the Pacific. Ensign George Gay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him. His aircraft, riddled with bullets, and his gunner killed, crashed just short of the carrier Kaga. Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, witnessing the battle that would change the course of the war. According to declassified action reports from the National Archives, as cited in Walter Lord's Incredible Victory, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was not in vain. They drew Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupted defensive formations. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise met the same fate. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led his 14 aircraft into the maelstrom, but only 4 survived the attack. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, arriving 30 minutes later, lost 10 of 12 aircraft. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese fleet that morning, only 6 returned to their carriers. But the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. High above, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers searched desperately for the enemy fleet. Low on fuel and facing the prospect of a fruitless return, McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northeast, the Arashi, hurrying to rejoin the main force after depth charging an American submarine. Following the destroyer's wake like a highway, McCluskey's Dauntlesses climbed to 14,000 feet and suddenly beheld the entire Japanese fleet spread out below them like toys on a blue carpet. At 10:22, McCluskey pushed over in his dive, leading 37 screaming aircraft toward the heart of the Japanese fleet. The next 4 minutes would transform the Pacific War. As McCluskey's bombers dove on the Kaga and Akagi, Lieutenant Mo. Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown appeared simultaneously over the Soryu. The Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for launch, had become floating ammunition dumps. At 10:26, the first American bomb struck the Akagi just behind the island, igniting the armed aircraft spotted on her deck. Within seconds, the flagship of the Kido Butai was transformed into a blazing inferno. The thunder of diving aircraft engines filled the sky as Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier, Akagi. At 14,000 feet, the entire Japanese fleet spread beneath him like a detailed wargame map. 4 precious aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, lay vulnerable and exposed, their flight decks crowded with fueled aircraft armed for the strike that would never come. "This is it, boys," McCluskey radioed to his squadron. "Make it count." At 10:26 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the first 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just aft of her island superstructure. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and munitions scattered across the hangar deck during the frantic rearming process. Within seconds, Admiral Nagumo's flagship became a floating torch, her wooden flight deck erupting in sheets of flame that reached toward the tropical sky. Simultaneously, 17 dive bombers from Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown squadron screamed down toward the carrier Soryu. Petty Officer Kyoto Furuta, manning an anti-aircraft gun, watched in fascination and terror as the American aircraft dove through the murderous defensive fire. "They came down like hawks," he would later recall, their wings folded back, diving straight into hell. The Soryu took 3 direct hits in rapid succession. The first bomb penetrated her flight deck and exploded among aircraft being rearmed in the hangar. The second struck near the forward elevator, buckling the steel deck plates and igniting fuel lines that snaked across the hangar floor. The third bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Harold Bottomley, crashed through to the ship's magazines. The resulting explosion lifted the Soryu's entire bow section momentarily out of the water. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading a three-plane section from McCluskey's group, had spotted the carrier Akagi already burning and shifted his attack to the undamaged Kaga. His 1,000-pound bomb struck just forward of the superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck where 42 aircraft waited with full fuel tanks. The explosion created a chain reaction that turned the massive carrier into an inferno within minutes. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding the Kaga, stood on his burning bridge as flames consumed his ship. "The Americans have caught us with our kimonos down," he told his executive officer, using a phrase that would become legendary in Japanese naval circles. Emergency crews battled desperately to control the fires, but aviation gasoline had spread throughout the ship's compartments, creating an uncontrollable blaze. On the Akagi's bridge, Admiral Nagumo stood paralyzed as his staff officers urged him to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, finally made the decision for him. "Admiral, we must abandon ship. The fires are beyond control." As documented in Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war memoir, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, the simultaneous destruction of 3 carriers in 4 minutes represented the most devastating naval defeat in Japanese history. The transformation was stunning in its completeness. At 10:22, the Kido Butai had possessed overwhelming superiority, with 4 operational carriers and experienced air crews poised to launch a decisive strike. By 10:30, 3 carriers were burning wrecks, their aircraft destroyed, their elite pilots dead or swimming in the Pacific. In 4 minutes, the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. But the battle was far from over. Captain Taemon Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier division that included the Hiryu, had positioned his ship apart from the main formation. As smoke columns rose from his burning compatriots, Yamaguchi prepared to strike back with the only operational Japanese carrier remaining. His 2 attack waves, hastily organized but flown by experienced pilots, would soon demonstrate that the Japanese fighting spirit remained unbroken. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters toward the American fleet, determined to exact revenge for the morning's catastrophe. Behind him, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the dawn attack on Midway, prepared a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. Despite a damaged fuel tank that virtually guaranteed he would not return, Tomonaga insisted on leading the attack himself. The Hiryu's counterattack would test American damage control and fighting spirit, but the strategic initiative had already passed to the United States. The cream of Japanese naval aviation was burning on the bottom of the Pacific, and with it died Japan's hope of winning the Pacific War. The radar screens aboard the USS Yorktown painted an ominous picture at 11:55 on June 4, 1942. 18 Japanese aircraft, launched from the carrier Hiryu in desperate retaliation, approached from the northwest at high speed. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered general quarters as his crew prepared for the enemy's revenge. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading the Yorktown's fighter cover, climbed his 6 Wildcats toward the incoming threat. The odds were daunting. His small group of fighters against experienced Japanese pilots, burning with the desire to avenge their destroyed carriers. But Thatch had developed innovative tactics that would soon make him a legend in naval aviation. "Use the Thatch weave," he radioed to his pilots, referring to the defensive maneuver he had perfected. As the Japanese dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs, Thatch's fighters scissored back and forth, each pilot covering his wingman's tail in a deadly aerial ballet that confused the attacking Zeros. At 12:10, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi's Aichi dive bomber screamed down through the American defensive fire. The Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns created a steel curtain around the ship, but 3 Japanese bombs found their mark. The first struck near the island, killing or wounding 66 men. The second penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among stored aircraft. The third bomb hit the ship's stack, reducing her speed to 6 knots and filling her engineering spaces with deadly smoke. Chief Damage Control Officer Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich led repair parties through smoke-filled compartments as the Yorktown fought for her life. "We've got fires on 3 decks," he reported to Captain Buckmaster. but the hull is intact, and we can make repairs. The crew's damage control efforts were nothing short of miraculous. Within an hour, they had extinguished the fires, patched the flight deck with steel plates, and rigged auxiliary power to restore the ship's speed. By 1:30, the Yorktown was recovering aircraft again, her battle flags flying defiantly in the Pacific breeze. But Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's torpedo attack was still approaching. The Japanese pilot, flying with a damaged fuel tank that leaked precious gasoline into the sky, led 10 Kate torpedo bombers in what he knew would be his final mission. At 2:45, his aircraft appeared low on the horizon, skimming just above the wavetops in classic torpedo attack formation. The Yorktown's gunners opened fire at maximum range, filling the air with deadly projectiles. One by one, the Japanese torpedo bombers fell into the sea, but 4 aircraft broke through the defensive screen. Tomonaga's own plane, trailing smoke and flame, pressed its attack with samurai determination before crashing into the Pacific just short of its target. According to the ship's action report, preserved in the Naval Historical Center archives and referenced in Robert Ballard's Return to Midway, the Yorktown's crew displayed extraordinary courage and skill during the 2-hour battle. 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port, side within seconds of each other. The explosions opened massive holes below the waterline, flooding several compartments and causing a severe list to port. The ship's electrical power failed, her engines stopped, and she began settling by the head as thousands of tons of seawater poured into her hull. Captain Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship at 3 p.m. The crew went over the side in orderly fashion, many jumping into the oil-slicked water as destroyers moved in to rescue survivors. But the Yorktown refused to die. Her strong construction and excellent damage control design kept her afloat despite catastrophic damage. Admiral Frank Fletcher, who had been forced to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria, watched his former flagship settle lower in the water. The Yorktown had been his home for months of combat operations, from the Coral Sea to this climactic battle at Midway. Now she lay dead in the water, her flight deck canted at an impossible angle, her crew scattered across the Pacific. Unknown to the Americans, a Japanese submarine was already approaching the scene. Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, in the I-168, had been patrolling the area when he spotted the damaged carrier. The opportunity was too good to pass up, a chance to sink a major American warship and partially redeem the day's disasters. But even as the Yorktown fought her final battle, the outcome at Midway had already been decided. The strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively in America's favor, and the road to Tokyo lay open before the resurgent United States Navy. At 5 o'clock on the evening of June 4, 1942, Captain Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the last operational ship in what had been the most powerful naval striking force in history. Around him lay the burning hulks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy reduced to smoking scrap metal in a single morning's action. Yamaguchi, considered one of Japan's most aggressive and capable carrier commanders, faced an impossible decision. His ship had launched 2 desperate counterattacks against the American fleet, badly damaging the carrier Yorktown, but at a terrible cost. Most of his experienced pilots were dead, his aircraft depleted, and enemy forces still outnumbered him 3-1. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher, appeared in the sunset sky at 6 p.m. The Hiryu's depleted fighter cover rose to meet them, but only 5 Zeros remained operational. As the American Dauntlesses rolled into their attack dives, Yamaguchi ordered his ship to turn into the wind for maximum maneuverability. "All guns commence firing!" shouted the Hiryu's gunnery officer, as anti-aircraft shells burst around the diving Americans. But the experienced pilots pressed their attack through the defensive fire. Lieutenant Commander Gallagher's bomb struck just forward of the carrier's island, penetrating to the hangar deck where it ignited fuel and ammunition. 3 more direct hits followed in rapid succession, each one adding to the inferno that consumed Japan's last operational carrier. Within minutes, the Hiryu was beyond salvation. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air as her aviation gasoline reserves exploded. Captain Kaku Tomio, the ship's commanding officer, reported to Yamaguchi that damage control efforts had failed. "The fires are spreading throughout the ship, sir. We cannot save her." Yamaguchi, a samurai of the old school, made his final decision with characteristic courage. Rather than abandon ship, he chose to go down with his command. At dawn on June 5th, after 24 hours of fighting the flames, the Hiryu's surviving crew was evacuated to accompanying destroyers. Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku remained aboard, standing at attention on the bridge as their ship slipped beneath the Pacific waves. The account of Captain Yamaguchi's final hours comes from survivor testimonies collected by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, as documented in Gordon Prang's comprehensive study, Miracle at Midway. The destruction of the Kido Butai represented more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic catastrophe from which Japan would never recover. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the battleship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the devastating reports throughout the day with growing disbelief. His carefully planned operation to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had instead resulted in the annihilation of Japan's elite carrier force. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto made the most difficult decision of his distinguished career. "Cancel the Midway operation and retire," he signaled to his scattered forces. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor and promised to dictate peace terms in Washington was retreating from a numerically inferior American force. The human cost was staggering. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men, including many irreplaceable veteran pilots. American losses were comparatively light: 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 307 men. But numbers alone could not measure the true significance of what had occurred in the waters around Midway Atoll. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay shattered on the Pacific floor. For the first time since the war began, American forces had met the Imperial Navy in decisive battle and emerged victorious. Ensign George Gay, rescued after 30 hours floating in the Pacific, would spend the rest of his life telling the story of Torpedo Squadron 8's sacrifice. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation had found the Japanese fleet at the crucial moment, became one of America's most decorated naval aviators. The men who fought at Midway had turned the tide of the Pacific War through courage, skill, and sacrifice. As the sun set on June 6, 1942, the strategic initiative in the Pacific had passed irrevocably to the United States. The road to Tokyo would be long and bloody, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Midway, in 4 minutes that changed the world, American forces had begun the long journey that would end on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, 3 years and 3 months later. The voices from Midway had spoken, and their message echoed across the Pacific. The rising sun was setting on the Japanese Empire,